This video was sponsored by Policy Genius. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this sweet mobile bar with this cool geometric pattern. I have wanted to make a bar like this for as long as I could remember. I mean, it's just always been something I've really been passionate about. Okay, that's a total lie. Let's back up and I'll show you where this began.
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name.
Man, I want a place where everybody knows my name.
White snow, red sky.
Now I wanted a bar that I could invite all my friends over to, a place where everybody would know my name. So I decided to start with my bar top first. Now I knew I wanted to do stainless steel because, well, it was pretty indestructible. But stainless steel was expensive. So after doing a lot of research online, I found these stainless steel workbench tops that are from Husky. I actually just bought these at Home Depot. They're supposed to go between two toolboxes, but hey, why not slap them on top of a bar? I also got these drop-in stainless steel coolers on Amazon. I figured we might as well stick with the stainless steel theme. All I have to do now is cut a hole in the top of the stainless steel bench tops and drop them in place. The only problem is I'm a woodworker and not a metal worker, so I don't really know the first thing about cutting holes in stainless steel. But I've never let that stop me before. So I marked out exactly where I needed to cut for my coolers to drop in there, grabbed a hammer and a chisel, and I quickly realized that metal is different than wood. I don't think these tools are going to work. So I did the next best thing. I learned long ago that if you don't know how to do something, you just find somebody that does and have them do it for you. So I took these tops to my friend Rick at Smith & Steel, and he used some fancy spinny wheel thingamabob and cut the squares out of the top. Now, these aren't just stainless steel tops. They're stainless steel that's wrapped around a solid hunk of MDF. So he was able to cut through the steel, but he refused to cut all the way through the MDF below. I said, "Whoa, Rick, don't worry about it, man. You cut the metal and I'll cut through the MDF myself. That's my speciality." Anyways, I just grabbed a multi-tool and started cutting. Sure, it took a while, and MDF is notorious for getting very hot, so it did burn and smoke like crazy, but I got them all cut out in the end, and boom, bang, bing, I had some holes cut in the top of my stainless steel workbenches that I could slide these coolers into nice and easy. After doing one side, I did the same thing to the other side, and there we go, 2 coolers. My plan here was to do 1 cooler for ice and beers, or whatever other beverages you want, and then 1 cooler just for ice that we could use for mixed drinks or ice water if you're laying off the hard stuff. Now, because my bar tops were kind of a set dimension, couldn't really do anything about that, I decided to build everything to fit the bar tops themselves. So the first thing I needed to do was start prepping some lumber to build my whole lower bar setup. So I cut down some mahogany to length, and then I went over to the table saw and I cut some 45-degree angles. Basically what I'm making here are some corner caps to cover up a plywood box that I will eventually make. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'm kind of all over the place with this build, building things a little bit out of order, so just stick with me till the end and I promise everything will make sense and come together eventually. Now I wanted to glue up these corner cap pieces, but I didn't want to have to worry about clamping them and gluing on some cauls, but then I remembered I had this lamello machine, which is kind of like a biscuit joiner, but the biscuits clip together so you don't have to use clamps. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to pull it out and use it to do these mitered corners, because I could just install the little plastic clips, pop them together, and forget about it until the glue dries. So after mortising out all my little biscuit hole thingamawhatsits, I pop in these plastic clips, both a male and female part, and then they should clip together, and according to the manufacturer details, it's 40 pounds of clamping pressure. So after squirting some thickened epoxy from Total Boat in my seam, I should be able to just click it and forget it. After squirting my thickened epoxy in there, I smoothed it all out with a paintbrush just to make sure I had nice even coverage, and then I started popping those lamello clips together. As you can see, they came together pretty nice and tight once I got all of them actually latched in there. There we go. Then I could just set it aside and move on to the next one. I'm going to do 6 of these corner pieces in total, and that'll all make sense eventually. Then I need to do 2 corner pieces that aren't a 45 degree, but they're going to be this weird dado half lap thingamawhatsit. Now this isn't going to make any sense right now, but eventually this will make perfect sense because this is going to create an area for us to land the hinge of the bar on and allow it to actually open up and become mobile and then collapse back down. So anyways, I ran one piece through the dado stack to cut a nice groove and allow me to sit another piece to kind of make this T-shaped thingamawhatsit. I feel like I'm barely into this video and I've already said thingamawhatsit like 6 times, but we've got a lot of steps to cover and no time to linger over poor vocabulary, so let's just move on. After getting my teed, dado, slot, whatever you want to call them, things in clamps, it was finally time to move on to actually making my cabinet box. Now I'm building this in a very strange way. I don't really know why I decided to do it this way, but I'm doing it this way. And that's basically, I'm going to build the cabinet box and then I'm going to frame everything around it versus building the frame and then filling in with plywood. So I started ripping and cutting down pieces of plywood to make my box, and then eventually I'll just fit all my trim pieces around it and make it look real nice. Now because I'm going to be trimming out the entire thing in solid mahogany, I didn't need to spend a lot of time making sure my box was super strong and sturdy. So I'm just going to glue and tack all my pieces together with a 16 gauge brad nailer, and it'll get stronger the more layers we add on to it. If you don't believe me, just trust me on this. I know I keep saying that, but I promise everything will come together in the end. So after adding on my 2 sides, I squirted some more glue on the back, and then I actually added in, well, the back. And now we have a 3-sided box that will make up the carcass of our collapsible mobile bar. Once again, I just tacked and glued everything together. Don't get too hung up on details here, just keep moving the ball forward. I did build these somewhat similar to the way I do a normal cabinet carcass, where I do kind of all my backs and sides and then I just add some simple support braces on the top. These again, I just glued and tacked in place. Don't worry, it'll be fine. Just trust me. Now because this is going to be a collapsible mobile bar made up of 2 sections, we basically have to do every step in this entire building process twice. This will be a common theme as we move forward, and eventually we should wind up with 2 identical pieces that will fold and connect to each other and create a collapsible bar. Kind of like this. See, there's going to be a pivot point. It'll fold up to make a nice box, and then you'll just open it back up when you want a full-size bar. Now I did make one kind of big mistake. I made my cabinet carcasses about 1.5 inches too small. So I just glued an extra piece of 3/4 inch ply on both sides, and that made up the difference. Hey, I'm only human. After getting my cabinet carcasses all put together, it was time to start making them pretty. So I grabbed my pre-glued up 45-degree angle corner pieces that I made earlier, and now I had to measure them to fit around the outside perimeter of my box. So after taking measurements off the carcass, I went over to the chop saw and I trimmed them down to the correct size. Now I started laying out the pieces on my box and then quickly realized this was going to be way easier if the box was standing upright. So before I moved forward, I wanted to get the casters mounted on the bottom of the box so that I could raise everything up and hopefully have an easier time trimming it all out. Now, I pushed the two boxes together into the position that they will be in when the bar is collapsed. And the casters were a little trickier than you might think, because I couldn't just slap one caster in each corner, because then the casters, when they rotate, would bang into each other, and that wouldn't be good. So we had to figure out a way to kind of offset the casters a little bit so that they could all spin freely without knocking into one another. So you'd have a smooth ride when you're pushing your mobile bar around your backyard. So, putting our heads together, me and Craig developed a nice system that I like to call random caster, where we just kind of threw casters in random places and made sure they just didn't run into each other. That was the only rule. It's like Fight Club. The only rule is you don't put casters in the wrong place. Or talk about casters. Anyways, after figuring out where all the casters needed to go, I screwed them onto the bottom of our plywood box, and then we flipped everything back over so we could continue on with the whole trimming out and making it look pretty process. Are you confused yet? I told you I kind of bounced all over the place with this build, but I have a plan. I think. You might also notice that I took the brace pieces out of the one on the right side. That's because I realized they were in the way of the coolers sitting down where they needed to go. So, anyways, that's the explanation for that. After getting the casters on and making sure they rolled nice and smoothly, I started clamping on all of our corner trim pieces. Now my plan here was to get all my corner trim pieces clamped on, measure the distances between all the trim pieces, and add some horizontal rails. Then once I had all those pieces added, I could mark out for dominoes and cut all my mortise and tenons. And then hopefully, and somewhat magically, figure out a way to glue everything back up around our plywood box without making a terrible mess or any mistakes. Again, I don't know why I decided to do it this way, but I picked a direction, I went with it, and now I gotta stick to my guns. So let's just cross our fingers in unison and hope this turns out for the best. So, as I mentioned, after getting all my corner caps clamped firmly in place, I started measuring and cutting pieces to fit in between all of those, to create the look of a traditional cabinet with inset plywood, but the only difference is obviously the plywood's just behind the cabinet framing, not inset. And, well, eventually I got all my little pieces cut in between and started marking out for my domino joinery. Making sure to label everything very, very well, because I'm going to take all the clamps off these pieces here in a few minutes and everything's going to come apart. And if it's not labeled well, there's a chance that it's not going to go back together the way that you originally had it. So make sure you label everything. I just like to use numbers or smiley faces or Morse code, whatever you want to do to make sure that all your pieces go back together the way they should. That's fine. Just mark stuff thoroughly. With everything marked, I started dominoing my life away. There was a lot of things to domino, and I had to be careful to make sure everything was lined up exactly how it needed to be. So I just went slow, listened to some jams on my ISO tunes, and eventually I was ready to glue this whole thing up. I just wasn't exactly sure the best way to do this. I mean, how do you glue up a four-sided cube around a four-sided plywood box without making a huge mess and having enough time to get everything glued up before the glue dries? Well, the first thing to do is to not use glue. I went back to the thickened epoxy because this would give me a way longer open time so that I'd have more room for air. Then I just started gluing things together. I glued the back frame of my box together first, and then I had this crazy idea that I could just take this frame, lay it down on the ground, squirt some more thickened epoxy in there so that I would actually be gluing it to the plywood box, and then maybe I could just lay down my plywood carcass inside that frame and build the rest of the frame around it. I mean, it sounds so crazy, it's gotta work, right? So I did just that. I slowly lowered that carcass into place, making sure it sat nice and even on that back frame section, and then I just started adding some more thickened epoxy to all my other pieces, putting some dominoes in every joint, and slapping them on there. Before long, I was able to work myself around the entire perimeter of my cabinet carcass, and all I had left to do now was stick the final top frame piece on, and boom! The whole thing was locked into beautiful mahogany and looked somewhat like I knew what I was doing. Even though between you and me, I've never built anything this way before, and I'm just as shocked as you are watching this that it actually worked the way that it was supposed to. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't I just make my whole frame out of mahogany and inset like a 1/4-inch piece of ply in between all of my frame pieces? Well, the reason is that I'm gonna tack on this crazy geometric pattern, and I wanted something thicker than 1/4 of an inch to tack that pattern to. That's why I went with the 3/4-inch carcass and framed it all out in this manner. Now, you could probably just glue and tack the frame pieces on, but there's always a chance that they're going to separate and your seams aren't going to be perfect, and I just thought it would last a little better with the dominoes in there. And as weird of a way of building as it was, in the end of the day, it worked exactly as I planned. So after successfully getting one of my bar sections all framed out, I just repeated the process on my second bar section until that too was completely framed in beautiful epoxy smeared mahogany, and I had all the clamps in all the right places, and all I had to do now was sit back and wait for that epoxy to dry.
Do you ever think about the future? I mean, really think about the future? Sometimes I wonder, where am I going to be in 10 years, 15 years? Am I going to be doing the same thing? And then sometimes I think, what if I'm not here? What if something happens to me? Which isn't a fun thing to think about, but I feel like as a responsible adult, I have to think that way. And I also have to plan and make sure the people I care about are taken care of in case the worst happens. And that's why I love Policy Genius. They make it incredibly easy to make sure that your loved ones are taken care of by allowing you to compare life insurance quotes quick and easy. If you don't believe me, just check this out.
The proprietary technology at Policy Genius makes it easy to save. In minutes, you can compare personalized quotes from top companies to find the lowest price and coverage you need. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. Their team of licensed experts will help you understand your options and ensure you apply for the right policy. You see, Policy Genius works for you, not the insurance companies, so you can trust them to offer unbiased advice and help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process.
All that's well and good, but you might be asking yourself, okay, where do I go? How do I get started? Well, that's really easy. You just do this.
All you got to do is head to policygenius.com/bourbonmoth to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save.
Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right.
While I waited for all the epoxy on my framing to dry, I decided to start cutting all of the pieces for my crazy geometric pattern that I was planning for the inset portions of my bar. This consisted of milling a lot of lumber. First, I started cutting down a lot of pieces to 2 3/4 of an inch. I don't know why I picked 2 3/4 of an inch, it just seemed like a good number. Then I took all of those pieces and I ran them through the table saw, cutting them directly in half. I did this in 2 passes, cutting 3/4 of the way through on my first pass and then flipping the board around and cutting all the way through on my second pass, leaving me with 2 somewhat evenly shaped, thinner pieces. After I had all those pieces ripped in half, I went over to the planer and I planed them down to a nice uniformed 1/4 of an inch. Just like this. Then it was time to start cutting out my geometric shapes. Now this is basically just going to be a bunch of triangles that when put together make a cool square, diamond, star pattern. You can see lots of different shapes in this, so the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is one of those patterns that looks really complicated and hard, but it's really not. It just takes a lot of time. And there's a difference between something taking a lot of time and something being really hard. All you have to do is set up a stop block, set your chop saw to 60 degrees, and just alternate the board back and forth to cut a perfect triangle shape. And then you just put all the triangles together and it makes a cool pattern. Kind of like this. The real reason most people don't do patterns like this is not because they're hard, but because they take such a frickin' long time. I stood at the chop saw for hours, a day almost, just cutting triangle after triangle after triangle. So many triangles. And after I'd cut a bunch of triangles, I wasn't done. Then I had to take them over to my oscillating belt sander and bevel the edge, all 3 sides. This really makes sure that that pattern pops once you hook everything together. It also is just a little bit of a buffer for making sure that your seams don't have to be perfect. So I sanded and sanded and sanded and sanded. And when I was finally done sanding and I thought I had enough pieces, it was time to, well, hook them all on the face of my bar, which wasn't gonna be a quick task either. Before I was ready, however, to hook them on the front of the bar, I needed to do just a little prep work, and that was sand off all of my epoxy fingerprints I left when I was gluing my frame pieces together. Now, these triangle pieces are a lot like just laying tile, which means that you kind of have to map out how you want your pattern to go before you start hooking pieces down. This way you're not going to be left with one section of tiny little pieces that you have to cut, and it also ensures that everything's going to be nice and even and not off-centered. So after laying enough pieces down that I could kind of get a lay of how the pattern was going to unfold, I started just gluing them in place with a little Titebond 3 and tacking them down with a 23 gauge pin nailer. I experimented with the best way to do this. At one point I just smeared a bunch of glue on the plywood thinking that might speed up the process, but I was getting a lot of squeeze out in between each piece. So in the end I realized that even though it took a little bit longer, the best way to do it was apply glue to each individual piece, put it in place, and tack it down. I slowly just worked my way across the bar face until I had all of my full pieces in place, and then I got to the outer sections where I actually had to start cutting down pieces to fit. Now at first my plan was to try and cut all these pieces perfectly so that I have a nice tight fit around the entire perimeter. And then I quickly said, that's stupid, don't do that. Just cut them loose, leave a gap, and trim it all up with a nice piece of pencil trim later to cover your mistakes. I mean, that's what real woodworkers do, isn't it? They make mistakes and then just cover them up. Nobody has to know. So I just loosely laid the pieces on there, marked them with a pencil, ran over to the bandsaw, cut along my pencil line, and then took all the pieces back over and plopped them in place. Now you can see there's a pretty big gap, but as I mentioned, it doesn't matter. I'll come in with a nice piece of pencil trim, cover that up, and you will never know that I was terrible at perfectly cutting all those pieces. In fact, the pencil trim I think will actually make it look a little fancier, more refined, robust, barish. For the most part, I lucked out and didn't have to do any crazy cuts to make pieces fit. But on the side, I did come into a situation where there was a lot of pieces coming together. The way I cut these was I just kind of roughly laid them out and put a piece of tape down to mark where I needed to cut my line. Then with all 4 pieces taped together, I took those over to the bandsaw, cut right along my tape line, zip zap zoop, went back over, peeled my tape off, and plopped them into place. Again, note the giant gap along the edge. Normally I wouldn't draw attention to my mistakes, but I don't consider this a mistake because it was a planned janky gap. and if it's planned, it can't be a mistake. Then after getting one piece entirely coated with those triangles and that pattern starting to look pretty darn snazzy, I was, well, I wasn't done. I was halfway done, because like a moron, I designed a bar where you have to build everything twice. So I grabbed another armful full of triangles, brought them over, and started doing the exact same process on my other bar piece. But because this is a YouTube video, you don't have to suffer through that entire process. Look, it's done. So with all of our triangles firmly attached to the front of the bar, it was time to clean it up and hide all those gaps I was talking about. So I just took some scrap pieces of the mahogany I had left over, cut down a nice 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch piece of trim, applied a little bit more glue, and tacked it in place, again with a 23 gauge brad nailer. See that giant gap right there on the edge? What gap? It's gone. Nobody ever has to know. And like I said, it kind of adds another depth to the whole front and makes it look a little classier. So with all my triangles and geometric pattern done, it was finally time to hook this bar together and make two things become one. Kind of like a marriage. I'm like a pastor of bars, unifying these two souls together for eternity with a stainless steel piano hinge. Remember how 3 of our 4 corners had those mitered caps and then one corner had this weird dadoed T thing? Yeah, here's where that dadoed T half-lap slotted piece comes into play. This is where we're going to attach our hinge, and it's going to stick out the exact same distance as the overhang on our bar top and allow the entire thing to open up and then close back together without smashing into itself. So very carefully, I clamped the hinge to our little overhang piece, screwed it in place, and what do you know? The bar rolls, it opens, it closes, and we're well on our way to mobile bar perfection. After getting my hinge installed, next I installed some stainless steel latches on the other side so that you could latch it closed when it's all folded up and it wouldn't be flying open on you. I installed one on the top and one on the bottom. And then it was time to start working on our actual tops. Get those all installed and in place. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these are stainless steel tops. And if you're thinking, those don't look stainless steel, they look white. Well, they have a protective plastic coating on them, so just ease off. First, I set the top in place that had our 2 drop-in coolers and dropped in the coolers to make sure everything was lined up nice and even. Then I took my full bar top and set it on the other side. Now I wanted to set these in place and make sure everything was aligned and that when I went to fold it shut, none of the tops would run into the other one and, make it so it couldn't fold shut, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose of a collapsible mobile bar. Now the full stainless steel top was really easy to install. I just sent some stainless steel screws up from the bottom into that MDF. But the one with the cutouts was a little trickier because I didn't have those plywood brace pieces on the bottom side to screw through. So to install this top, first I put down a layer of thickened epoxy just as a little added security, and then added some pocket holes to drill into the perimeter. I think that'll be enough to hold it in place. Unless we get really crazy one night and try and reenact that scene from Coyote Ugly, where people are dancing all over the bar top. And if that happens and it breaks, well, it was totally worth it. After getting my bar tops installed, next I had to figure out my drain system for the coolers. Because obviously they were going to eventually fill with water from melted ice, and that water had to have a way to escape. Luckily, these coolers came with some built-in drains. I just had to drill holes in my plywood shelf for those drains to pass through. So first I drilled a little pilot hole with a small drill bit, and then I used a Forstner bit. I like to use the pilot hole method because that way I can come in with my Forstner bit from both sides and make sure I don't have any blowout through that plywood. So first I drilled halfway through on the bottom, then all the way through on the top, and I got a nice clean hole. Next I took the little drain thingamabobs that came with the drop-in coolers, and I screwed them onto the bottom. Then I slid the coolers back into place and made sure that that drain lined up with my hole. And it did. Perfectly. Because that's how we do things at Bourbon Moth. At least 60% of the time. Next, I attached these little flexible drain thingamawhatsits, and then I had to go a little rogue, because that's as far as the pre-bought coolers went. So I had to come up with some sort of system to link those two drains together and then eventually drain outside of the bar altogether. So I just went to Home Depot, bought a bunch of random PVC attachments here and there, and started making a robot. And then Craig was like, quit making a robot, we have to make a drain. So then I put pieces together to make a drain. I also got a little spigot for the outside, hooked all the pieces together like this, and now all the water should funnel down into that pipe that goes outside of the spigot. You can just attach a hose onto it and drain it over into the flower bed. Next, I wanted to install some little fold-down work surfaces on the back of the bar, so that if you're behind the bar, you can fold them down to mix drinks on or cut up limes. It's also a nice way to store everything in the little cubbies and make sure that it doesn't fall out onto the ground. So again, I just grabbed some stainless steel piano hinges and a piece of mahogany, screwed the hinge onto the inside, and there we go. Fold-down work surface. I did one on each side, and then to make sure they stayed latched when you weren't wanting to use them, I installed these little slide latches into a little hole I drilled on the side, and we were that much closer to the perfect bar setup. See? Little work surface over here, little work surface over there. What do you know? Looking fancy. Then I took some old pipe I had laying around and made a paper towel holder, because I make messes a lot and need to wipe things down from time to time. Then I added some other accoutrements, a garbage can for waste, a couple of these just store-bought crates to hold things and keep them from rolling around, and this bar was darn near complete. There was just one thing left to do, and I saved it for the end because I thought it was going to be the most satisfying. And it turned out to be the hardest part of this build yet. And that was to peel this stupid plastic off the top of the stainless steel. I really thought this was going to be like a beautiful shot, wonderful moment, me slowly peeling this plastic off. But it would not come off. I even tried getting out a heat gun to see if maybe that would make it easier, but I just started to melt the plastic to my fingers and make a horrible mess. So I peeled, and I pulled, and I pulled, and I peeled. Eventually I even asked Craig to come help me, and there was just no quick way to do this. I'm sure someone's watching saying like, oh, you just got to do this. I don't know what this stuff was made of, but it did not want to come off. After getting all the plastic peeled off, finally, I started installing those drop-in coolers. Now, the installation process was pretty darn easy. You just drop them in. I did, however, put a nice layer of silicone caulking all the way around the perimeter to make sure that water didn't leak into our bar cabinet. After getting my silicone all in place, I just plopped them in, squished them down, and then wiped up all of the excess silicone caulking. Geez. How many times are you going to say silicone caulking in a single sentence? And with that, the bar was complete. There was just one thing left to do. Call up all my friends, invite them over for a big bar blowout. Finally, I had what I'd always wanted. My own bar. Well, what I had always wanted since 2 days earlier when I had the idea to make this. I wheeled it outside, and setting it up was a breeze because of the smart, compact design. I undid the latches. Yep, just like that. I folded it open, revealing the true barness of this bar. I spun it around, and I was ready to set up shop. I folded down my little work tables to make serving drinks much easier for all my friends. I got these sweet U-kegs from Growler Works that you can just fill up with beer, so anytime you want a cold one, you can just walk right up to the bar. They're CO2 charged, and pour yourself a cold pint, kind of like this right here. Yes, there is a link in the video description, and I can attest that these things are awesome. Then I went over to the coolers, and I filled one cooler up with ice cold beverages, like 6 packs of beer soda. No, it's actually beer. And then of course dumped in ice to keep everything nice and chilly cold. I got this ice from a local truck stop, so you know it's the good stuff. And then I filled the other side up just with ice because, you know, you might want ice for a nice mixed cocktail. You gotta have mixed drinks at a bar. By that time I was getting a little parched, so I thought I might as well make myself a little mixed drink. And when I say mixed drink, I mean something simple, like Old Tom gin and ice. I mean, that counts as a mixed drink, right? Smells good and tastes delicious. And with that, the bar was set up. This project was so much fun. I love projects like this where I have zero plan. I just go out to the shop and start throwing wood together and actually come up with something that I'm really proud of. This thing is both functional and, well, it's a looker. Now I just gotta wait for all my friends to show up.
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. We wanna be where the troubles are all the same. We want to go where everybody knows your name.